The word hit the room like a bullet fired into silence. Enough! James Atkins stood at the head of the long pine table, his weathered hands pressed flat against the grain, his dark eyes sweeping across the faces of his three sons with a look that had silenced arguments, ended fistfights, and once made a hired gun turn and ride away without collecting payment. His jaw was set. The lines carved deep into his 52-year-old face were not from age alone, but from 23 years of drought and grief and stubbornness and love worn down to its barest, most essential form. His eldest son, Cole, sat with his arms crossed and his mouth pulled into a hard line. Beside him, the middle son, Rand, stared at the table like he was counting knots in the wood. The youngest, Danny, barely 20, looked between his father and his brothers with wide eyes that did not yet know how to hide what they felt. "She is not a stranger anymore," James said, and his voice was low and rough and absolute, the voice of a man who had earned the right to say things once and mean them forever. "She is the heart of everything here." Cole pushed back from the table so hard the chair scraped a wound across the floor. "You don't know what she did, Pa. You don't know what she's hiding. I know what I see." James straightened to his full height, and even at 52, even with the gray threading through his dark hair and the permanent ache in his left shoulder from an old injury, he was a man who filled a room the way mountains fill a horizon. "I know what kind of woman rides 300 miles alone to start over. I know what courage looks like, and I know what fear looks like, and that woman out there in my barn right now has got more of the first and a fair amount of the second, and neither one of those things makes her dangerous." "There's a letter," Cole said. His voice dropped. "There's a letter, Pa, from a man in Abilene. And it says things about Ella Collins that you need to read before you go making declarations at your own table about what she is and what she isn't." The name landed differently now that it was spoken aloud. Ella Collins. James said nothing for a long moment. The fire in the hearth behind him crackled and threw orange light across the room. Outside, the Texas wind moved across the flat land with a sound like something breathing. Then he said, "Get me the letter." And it was in that moment, with his sons watching him and the fire at his back, and the night pressed up against every window, that James Atkins understood with a clarity that felt almost like pain that the story of how Ella Collins had come to mean everything had to be told from the beginning. Because the beginning was the only thing that could save them both from what was coming. It had started 6 weeks ago, on a Tuesday in October of 1878, when the stagecoach from San Antonio rolled into the small town of Harlan's Creek, Texas, carrying 3 passengers and a mail sack and a woman who looked like she had not slept in 4 days. Harlan's Creek was not the kind of town that appeared on maps drawn by men who had never crossed the Pecos River. It existed because a man named Jerome Harlan had decided 30 years ago to build a trading post at a bend in the creek, and enough people had decided to stop and stay that eventually there was a general store and a livery and a church without a steeple and a saloon that doubled as the town's only hotel. The population in the fall of 1878 was somewhere between 200 and 240, depending on who you counted and who had drifted away since the last time anyone bothered to tally. Into this town, on a Tuesday with clouds building in the south and the smell of rain coming up behind the dust, stepped Ella Collins. She was 27 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned at the back of her neck in a way that was practical rather than fashionable, and her eyes were a shade of hazel that changed with the light, going green in the sun and brown in shadow. She was not a tall woman, but she held herself like the space she occupied was hers by right rather than permission. She wore a traveling dress the color of dried sage, and she carried a single carpet bag that was heavier than it looked because it contained not just clothing but 3 books, a tin photograph of her mother, and a small journal with a leather cover that she had been writing in since she was 15 years old. She had come from St. Louis by train to Dallas, and from Dallas to San Antonio by a combination of rail and coach, and from San Antonio to Harlan's Creek by the weekly stage that stopped in 7 towns before it reached the last stop on the line. She had been traveling for 11 days. She had slept poorly on every one of them. She stepped off the stage and looked at the street in front of her, and then she looked at the sky, and then she looked at the trading post with its hand-painted sign, and she breathed out slowly, the way a person breathes when they have arrived somewhere and are not entirely certain that arriving was the right choice but have run far enough that there is no longer a question of turning back. She had come to Harlan's Creek because of an advertisement. It had appeared in the St. Louis Dispatch 6 weeks before she left, placed by a land agent on behalf of a rancher who was in need of a housekeeper and who had, the advertisement stated plainly, 3 sons and no wife and more work than any 4 people could manage. The advertisement had not been for a bride. That was the thing Ella had understood clearly before she answered it. It was for a housekeeper, a position of employment. The kind of work that would put a roof over her head and coin in her pocket and enough distance between herself and St. Louis that certain people could no longer find her easily. She had written a letter of inquiry. The land agent had written back on behalf of the rancher, a Mr. James Atkins of the Rolling Cross Ranch, 12 miles south of Harlan's Creek. The terms were fair. $20 a month, room and board included, Sundays free. She had accepted by return post, packed her carpet bag, and boarded the train before the man in St. Louis who had been making her life impossible for 2 years could find out she was leaving. His name was Gerald Morrow. He was 44 years old, and he was the kind of man who could make himself appear charming in front of witnesses and terrifying in private. And he had decided when Ella's husband died of a fever in the spring of 1876 that she was now his to pursue. She had refused him. She had refused him 3 times in the gentlest possible way, and then 4 more times with increasing directness, and he had responded each time by making her life smaller. Her employment at the millinery where she worked had ended when he purchased the building and dismissed her. Her rooms had become unavailable when her landlord received a business offer from Morrow's associate. Her small circle of friends had been warned away with implications that she could not disprove and could barely understand. She was not naive. She had known by the winter of 1877 that he was capable of following her if she left and making trouble for whoever sheltered her. She had stayed because she had nowhere to go and no money that was not spoken for by rent and food. She had saved what she could. She had waited for her moment. The advertisement in the Dispatch had been her moment. Now she was standing in the dust of Harlan's Creek with her carpet bag at her feet and a letter in her pocket from the land agent with directions to the Rolling Cross Ranch, and she needed a horse or a wagon or someone willing to take her 12 miles south before nightfall. The man who offered was not who she expected. She had walked to the livery to ask about a hire horse and found it closed and turned around and nearly walked directly into a man so broad across the chest that she put her hand up instinctively to stop herself from colliding with him. Her palm connected with the front of his shirt, and she felt the warmth of him even through the cloth, and she stepped back quickly and looked up. He was not quite what she had expected a rancher to look like. She had formed a vague image from the advertisement's spare language, something older and more beaten down, a man reduced to advertising in newspapers because life had worn him to a stub. James Atkins was worn, certainly. But he was also, undeniably, still something. He stood there looking down at her from a height of at least 6 feet 2 inches, with dark eyes set under a serious brow and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the Texas hills behind him. He wore working clothes, dusty from the ride-in, and a battered hat that had seen more weather than most roofs. There was a reserve about him that was not rudeness exactly but was close to it, the particular stillness of a man who has learned not to waste energy on things that do not require it. "You looking for the livery?" he said. "It seems to be closed," Ella said. "Tom Deakins takes Tuesdays off. You need a horse." "I need transportation to the Rolling Cross Ranch. I have a letter here from your land agent if you are Mr. Atkins." She pulled the letter from her pocket without waiting for him to confirm it, because she had learned in St. Louis that if you waited for a man to confirm his own identity, you could wait for quite a long time. He looked at the letter, then at her, then back at the letter. Something moved across his face that she could not quite read. "You're the housekeeper," he said. "I am Ella Collins, yes. I've been hired as your housekeeper, if that is what you mean." He looked at her for a moment that was just slightly longer than comfortable, and she met his gaze without flinching, because she had also learned in St. Louis that flinching was something men like Gerald Morrow fed on, and men like James Atkins, she suspected, simply noticed and filed away. "Wagon's out front," he said. "I've got supplies to load. Be ready to leave in half an hour." It was not the warmest welcome she had ever received. It was also not the worst. She had received worse from people who were supposedly glad to see her. She said, "Thank you," and he nodded once and walked away, and she picked up her carpet bag and went to find a place to sit out of the wind while she waited. The ride to the rolling cross was 12 miles of flat land that opened as they left town into something vast and golden, and faintly terrifying in the way that all large open things are faintly terrifying to someone who has spent years in a city. The sky was enormous. The grass moved in long waves. The creek that gave the town its name appeared twice beside the road, cutting a dark line through the pale earth, and the cottonwood trees along its banks had gone yellow with October, and the yellow against the blue of the sky was the kind of color combination that made a person feel things they did not have the proper vocabulary to express. James Atkins drove the wagon without conversation. She had expected this, based on their exchange in town, and she did not try to fill the silence with anything other than her own observations, which she stored away in the back of her mind for the journal she would write in later. It was Danny who broke the silence when they arrived. He came running out of the barn before the wagon had fully stopped, a young man with his father's dark eyes and his mother's mouth, which Ella would not know was his mother's mouth for another 2 weeks, when she saw the portrait in the parlor. He was 20 years old and made no attempt to disguise his curiosity. "Is this her?" he asked his father, looking at Ella with a direct openness that was both refreshing and slightly overwhelming after the closed-off drive. "This is Miss Collins," James said, setting the brake. "She'll be keeping the house." "Ma'am," Danny said, and took off his hat with a sincerity that she found immediately charming. "I'm Danny. I've been doing the cooking, and I'll tell you right now it is a genuine emergency situation. I burned the biscuits 3 times last week alone." The first sound that Ella made at the Rolling Cross Ranch was a laugh. It came out before she could decide whether it was appropriate, and it was real rather than polite, and it transformed her face from composed and careful to something that surprised even James, who was stepping down from the wagon and happened to be facing her direction when it happened. He looked at her for just a moment too long. Then he looked away and began unloading supplies. Cole was a different story. Cole Atkins was 25 years old, with his father's build and a suspicious quality to his eyes that was entirely his own. He had come to the door of the house when the wagon arrived and stood watching from the porch with his arms crossed, and his expression noncommittal in a way that communicated, without a word, that he was reserving judgment and might never finish doing so. He said nothing to her that first evening beyond the bare minimum of civility, but she caught him watching her twice during supper, and both times when she looked up he shifted his gaze away without embarrassment, which told her the watching was assessment rather than interest. He was deciding something about her, and he had not decided it yet. Rand was 23 and quieter than either of his brothers, with a thoughtful quality that expressed itself in long pauses before he spoke. He worked harder than anyone on the ranch, which she learned later was a way of managing something inside himself that did not have a name, but was related to the grief of having lost his mother when he was 12 years old. He shook Ella's hand formally when they were introduced and said, "Welcome to the Rolling Cross, Miss Collins," and meant it sincerely and without complication. That first night she lay in the small room at the back of the house that had been cleared for her, with its one window looking south toward open country, and its hook on the wall for her coat, and the small iron stove in the corner that she was grateful for because October in South Texas could still turn cold after dark. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling, and she thought about Gerald Morrow and whether he knew yet that she was gone, and whether it mattered all the way out here. And she thought about the way James Atkins had looked at her when she laughed, the brief second of it before he turned away, and she pressed that thought very firmly to the side and told herself to go to sleep. She had not come here to feel things. She had come here to be safe. The work of the rolling cross began before dawn and did not end until after dark. Ella Collins had not been raised to be idle, and she had worked since she was 14 years old, and she was not frightened of work, but the scale of what this household required was larger than anything she had managed before. There were 4 men to feed 3 times a day. There was a house that had been cleaned with the particular careless efficiency of people who did not consider cleaning a priority, which meant it was technically functional and practically in need of a thorough going over from ceiling to floor. There was laundry and mending and the preservation work of fall. The putting up of whatever could be put up before winter made fresh provisions harder to come by. She threw herself into it the way she had learned to throw herself into things when she needed not to think. She had the house properly clean within the first week. The food improved dramatically by the 3rd day. By the end of the first week, Danny had appointed himself her unofficial assistant in the kitchen and was learning more about cooking than he had absorbed in the previous 20 years of his life, and he followed her around with questions that she answered with the kind of patient thoroughness that she used to give to the younger girls at the millinery. James watched all of this without comment. He was not an easy man to read. She had spent time around difficult men in St. Louis, men whose silence was a weapon or a manipulation, and she was alert to the particular flavors of silence that indicated danger. James's silence was not that. It was something more like density, a quality of compression in him, as if he had packed a great deal of experience and feeling into a small interior space and sealed it effectively. He was not warm. He was not cold. He was present in the way that bedrock is present, solid and unavoidable but not making any claims about it. He thanked her for the food the first night she cooked, and it surprised her because she had not expected it. He thanked her the second night too, and by the 3rd night she understood that this was not a performance but a habit, that whatever else James Atkins was, he was a man who expressed gratitude when he felt it, and this was more than could be said for a great many men she had known. On the 9th day, the incident with the well happened. Ella had gone out in the early morning to draw water before the men were fully awake, and the rope had been older than it looked, and it snapped when the bucket was half full, and the bucket went into the well and took the better part of the rope with it. She stood at the edge of the well looking down at the dark water 15 feet below and considering the problem with the practical assessment she brought to most problems. Don't lean over it like that. She straightened and turned. James was crossing the yard from the barn, moving with the unhurried efficiency that was characteristic of him, as if he was always covering exactly the distance required and no more. The rope snapped, she said. I can see that. The bucket is in the well. She stepped back to give him room, and he looked down into the well and then back at the rope in her hands, and then at her in a way that was assessing in a different register than Cole's assessment. Cole was looking for something wrong with her. James was looking for something to understand about her. I'll fish it out, he said. There's another bucket in the barn. I'll get it, she said, and before he could offer to do that too, she had turned and was walking toward the barn. When she came back with the bucket, he had retrieved the old one and was replacing the rope, working with the concentrated attention he brought to anything mechanical. And she stood back and watched his hands because hands told you things about people, and his hands told her that he had been doing physical work for decades, and that he was careful and precise, and that he wore no rings. She had noticed early that he wore no rings, and she had filed that away without examining why she was filing it. He finished replacing the rope and drew her a bucket of water without ceremony and set it at her feet, and she said, "Thank you," and he said, "Rope needed replacing anyway." And then they both stood there for one moment too long, and the morning light came over the edge of the eastern horizon and fell across them in the yard, and the chickens came around the corner of the barn making their complaints, and the moment ended as moments do. But something had shifted in it. Some small calibration of whatever it was between them. It was Cole who first understood that something was shifting, and Cole's response to this understanding was not generosity. He came to her in the kitchen on the 14th day with the particular deliberateness of a man who has decided to do something he has been thinking about doing for a while. He stood in the doorway and waited until she turned from the stove to face him, and then he said, "I need to ask you something directly, Miss Collins, and I would appreciate a direct answer." She had been expecting something like this. She set down the spoon. "All right," she said. "Why did you really come here? Not the advertisement, not the position. Why did you leave where you were and come all the way to Harlan's Creek, Texas?" She considered him. He was a serious young man, and he was not asking out of malice, she thought, but out of genuine protective instinct toward his father and brothers, the instinct of the eldest who had learned to stand between his family and whatever came at them. "I left," she said carefully, "because I needed to be somewhere that a particular man could not reach me easily." "What kind of man?" "The kind who does not understand that no is a complete answer." Cole's expression shifted slightly. "Someone was following you. Someone was making my life in St. Louis very difficult." He had money and influence and no willingness to use either of them for anything resembling decency. Cole said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Does my father know this?" "Your father knows I came from St. Louis and that I needed work. He did not ask for more and I did not offer it." "That sounds like information he should have." "I don't disagree," Ella said, "but it is mine to offer, not yours to demand." That stopped him. He had not expected pushback, and the fact that it was delivered without heat or defensiveness, but with simple, calm certainty appeared to land differently than anger would have. He looked at her for another moment, and then he said, "Fair enough," and left the kitchen. She turned back to the stove and let out a slow breath and acknowledged to herself that she had been frightened for the duration of that conversation in a way that did not show on her face and that she was grateful for. 3 days later, James came to the kitchen in the evening when everyone else had gone to their beds. She was finishing the last of the mending by lamplight, which was something she often did in the quiet of late evening because the house was still, and the work required only part of her attention and the rest of her attention could rest. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. "Cole tells me you had a reason to leave St. Louis beyond the advertisement," he said. She set down the mending. "Cole should have let me tell you myself. He didn't tell me the details. He told me to ask." James came into the kitchen and pulled a chair from the table and sat down across from her, which was not what she had expected. Men who wanted information usually positioned themselves above the person they were asking. He sat at the same level as her, elbows on his knees, looking at her directly. "So I'm asking," she told him, "not everything but enough." She told him about Gerald Morrow, and about the years after Thomas Collins died, when Morrow had made himself a presence in her life that she could not escape through ordinary means. She told him about losing her employment and her rooms, and the way her city had been made smaller around her through the application of money and pressure. She told him she had answered the advertisement because it offered distance and work and a place where she could breathe. James listened without interrupting. This was, she had come to understand, characteristic of him. He did not speak while someone else was speaking. He was fully present for the duration of what she said, his dark eyes on her face, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This man, he know where you went." "I don't believe so, I was careful. But he might find out. He has resources. I cannot say with certainty that he will not eventually locate me." She met his gaze. "I would have told you this before accepting the position if I had understood it to be the kind of thing that would matter." I did not hide it with any intention to deceive you. I simply needed to go somewhere first and worry about the rest of it later." James nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "All right, that is all. What else would there be?" He stood, and the chair scraped back on the flagstone floor. "A man who would do what you're describing to a woman on her own does not have any claim on decisions you make about where to live." He picked up the lamp he had brought with him from the hallway. "Get some sleep, Miss Collins. There's a fence line that needs riding tomorrow, and I need everyone sharp." He walked out of the kitchen. She sat alone in the dimmer light of her own lamp, and she felt something in her chest that she would later recognize as the particular sensation of trusting someone for the first time in a very long time. It was uncomfortable, the way a frozen limb hurts when warmth comes back to it. But it was undeniable. November arrived and brought cold that surprised her. She had expected Texas to be warmer than Missouri, and the days were, but the nights dropped in October and by November had a bite to them that reminded her the plains had no windbreaks worth the name. She found extra blankets in the chest at the end of the hallway and distributed them without being asked. And when she noticed that the gap under the kitchen door was letting in a draft, she found rags and plugged it. And when James came in from the morning work and noticed the draft was gone, he looked at the floor for a moment and then said, "Good thinking," in his brief, weighted way, and she accepted it. She was learning him. This was not something she had set out to do. It was simply what happened when you lived in close proximity to a person who was consistent in the ways that mattered and kept surprising you in the ways you did not expect. She learned that he was up before 4 every morning, and that the first thing he did was put the coffee on, and that he drank 1 cup at the table in the dark before anyone else was awake, not because he needed the silence, but because he was the kind of man who liked to greet the day alone before sharing it. She learned that he kept his late wife's Bible on the shelf in the parlor and did not read it, but also would not move it. She learned that he was harder on Cole than on Rand or Danny, not from preference but from the expectation that came with being the eldest, and that this caused a friction between them that was old and familiar, and neither of them fully understood how to resolve. She learned that he had a dry, rare humor that appeared only in certain kinds of moments, and that when it appeared, it changed his whole face in a way that was disorienting if you were not prepared for it. The moment she registered her own feelings for what they were came on a Wednesday in the 2nd week of November. She had burned her hand on the stove, not badly, but enough that it stung, and she had gone to the pump to run cold water over it, and had not heard James come into the kitchen because she was focused on the sensation in her palm. He had said her name, and she had turned, and he had crossed the room and taken her hand in both of his to look at the burn before she had time to process that he was doing it. He held her hand in his and looked at it with his characteristic concentrated attention, and then he said, "I'll get the salve." And she stood there while he crossed to the shelf and found the tin of comfrey salve and came back and applied it with a gentleness that was wholly inconsistent with his general presentation. A gentleness that she had not been prepared for, and that went straight past every careful defensive layer she had built in 2 years in St. Louis, and lodged itself in her chest like something warm and permanent. He bandaged it with a strip of clean cloth, working carefully and not speaking. When he was finished, he held her hand for 1 moment longer than the task required. And then he let it go and stepped back and looked at her, and whatever he saw in her face she did not know, but something moved across his. He said, "Be more careful," and his voice was slightly different than usual, lower by half a note. "I will," she said, and her voice was also different. He nodded and left the kitchen. She stood at the table with her bandaged hand and her heart beating in a way she had not given it permission to. It was 2 days after this that the first letter from Gerald Morrow arrived in Harlan's Creek. It was addressed to the land agent, Marcus Webb, and it asked, in language that was polite on the surface and threatening underneath, for the contact details of any women who had been placed through his services in the past 6 months. Marcus Webb was a cautious man and a practical one, and he did not give out the details of his clients. But he did mention to Tom Deakins at the livery that he had received an unusual inquiry, and Tom Deakins mentioned it to his wife, and Tom Deakins's wife mentioned it to the woman who ran the general store, and the woman who ran the general store was named Patsy Orman, and she was the best-informed person in Harlan's Creek, and she had taken a liking to Ella Collins in the 2 occasions Ella had come in with the weekly shopping list. Patsy sent a note with the delivery boy who came out to the Rolling Cross on Fridays, a folded piece of paper addressed to Miss Collins, and when Ella opened it, her face went very still in a way that Danny, who was in the kitchen with her, noticed and did not know what to do with. She excused herself and went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed with the note in her hands. So he had found the direction, if not the exact location. It had taken him 6 weeks. She had hoped for more time, but she was not surprised. Gerald Morrow had never lacked for persistence. She sat for a long time thinking about her options. She could leave. The thought came first, as it always did, the instinct toward movement that had carried her from St. Louis in the first place. But she looked at that option carefully and turned it over, and she saw that it was not actually a good option. She had come here for safety. Running would only delay the problem and leave her less resourced and in a worse position. The Rolling Cross was not nothing. It was something, in fact. It was 12 miles from town and a ranch with 4 men who, whatever else was true about any of them, were not small. She could tell James. She sat with that option. She had already told him the broad version. This was the specific version. This was the letter in her hand saying that the man she had fled was actively searching and had gotten close enough to write to her town. She wanted to find James. He was in the barn doing something with a harness that required both hands and considerable attention, and he looked up when she came in and his eyes went immediately to her face with the acuity that she had come to understand was a feature of how he processed things. He read faces the way some men read tracks. "What is it?" he said, and set down the harness. She held out the note. He wiped his hands on his trousers and took it and read it, and she watched his face do nothing visible but felt the shift in his attention, the recalibration of something. When he was done reading, he folded the note and handed it back. "He's in the area," he said. "It was not a question. He is looking. I don't believe he knows where I am exactly, but he knows what town. That's close enough." He picked up the harness again and hung it on its hook with deliberate hands and turned back to her. "You're not leaving," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. If that was in your head, take it out. You're not leaving because a man with money decides to look for you. That's giving him what he wants without him even getting here." Something happened in her chest that was close to relief and also slightly infuriating, because she did not want to feel relief at being told what she was and was not doing. "I was not necessarily planning to leave," she said. "Good." He looked at her steadily. "I'll ride in and speak with Marcus Webb tomorrow, and with the sheriff. The sheriff may not be inclined to trouble himself over a man who has not technically done anything illegal. Sheriff Holt and I have an understanding going back 15 years. He will be inclined." He said this without arrogance, simply as fact, and she believed him because she had come to understand that when James Atkins stated things as fact, they tended to be fact. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, and picked up the next piece of harness. She stood there for one more moment. "Thank you, Mr. Atkins." He glanced at her. "James," he said, "we've been here 6 weeks. You can call me James." "James," she said, and the word felt different in her mouth than Mr. Atkins had, closer and more particular, the way a name feels when it belongs to a specific and irreplaceable person. She walked back across the yard, and the morning was very bright and her bandaged hand felt warm where the salve was still working, and she was not safe yet, not really, but she felt something that functioned like safety, which was more than she had felt in 2 years. It was that same week that Cole found the second letter. This one had not come through Marcus Webb. This one had come directly, addressed to Miss Ella Collins at the Rolling Cross Ranch, which meant that Morrow now knew exactly where she was. Cole had ridden in for supplies and collected the mail, and the letter had been there in the bundle, and he had not opened it, but he had held it in his hand on the ride home and done the arithmetic, and arrived at a conclusion that was not generous to Ella. He brought it to the kitchen and set it on the table in front of her and said, "Whoever is looking for you found you." She picked up the envelope. She did not recognize the handwriting immediately, and then she did, and her face did the still thing again. "Who is he?" Cole said. "His name is Gerald Morrow. He is a man in St. Louis who you came all this way to get away from." Cole's voice was not unkind exactly, but it was pressed flat the way his voice got when he was managing something. "And he's followed you here. It appears that way. Then he's trouble and you brought trouble here." She looked up at him. She was not angry at this. She understood it. "I did not bring it intentionally." "Intentions don't change what it is." Cole pulled out a chair and sat down. "My father's taken a liking to you, and Danny thinks the sun rises and sets on you. And Rand doesn't say much about anything, but he's been smiling more since you got here, and that's not nothing. If this man shows up here, I know," she said quietly, "I know what it could mean." "Do you?" "I know the kind of man he is. I spent 2 years learning exactly what kind of man he is." She met Cole's gaze. "I am not careless about it." Cole looked at her for a long time. "No," he said finally. "I don't think you are." He pushed back from the table. "Tell my father about that letter." She told James that evening, and James read the letter, which was written in Morrow's polished hand, and said, among other things, that he had come to understand that Ella had placed herself in a situation that she might find difficult to maintain, and that he was certain when she thought it through carefully she would understand that returning to St. Louis was in her best interest, and that he would be happy to facilitate her return at his own expense, and that he hoped she was well. Every sentence of it was a trap dressed as courtesy. James set the letter down on the table. "He's coming," he said. "I believe so." "Then we'll be ready." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that was different from his usual contained expression, a heat to it that was not quite anger and was not quite anything she had a name for. "This man does not understand where you are now. He dealt with you when you were alone. You are not alone." She understood that he was trying to reassure her. She also understood, with a precision that was both gratifying and frightening, that what he was saying went beyond the practical offer of protection. He was making a declaration of a kind that James Atkins did not make easily or without meaning. She said, "James, I don't want you to feel obligated. I don't feel obligated." The words were immediate and flat. He picked up the letter and folded it and set it in his pocket. "I feel quite a few things, but obligated is not one of them." "Go to bed." She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about what he had said and what he had not said, and the way his voice had been when he said it. And she pressed both hands against her chest over her heart as if she could feel it working, and she said to herself very quietly, "You are in trouble of an entirely different kind, Ella Collins, and you have no one to blame but yourself." Gerald Morrow arrived in Harlan's Creek on a Tuesday in the first week of December. He arrived in a hired carriage, which was the kind of choice a man with money made in a place that had roads, except that the roads in this part of Texas were not the kind of roads that carriage travel accommodated gracefully. He arrived rumpled and less polished than usual, and he went directly to the general store and asked Patsy Orman where the Rolling Cross Ranch was. And Patsy Orman looked at him with the particular thoughtful gaze she brought to unusual visitors, and said she wouldn't know off the top of her head, and perhaps he should ask around. She sent the delivery boy directly to the Rolling Cross. James knew Morrow was in town before Morrow had finished brushing the dust from his coat. He called his sons together in the kitchen that evening and told them what was coming. Danny looked alarmed. Rand looked like he was calculating something. Cole looked unsurprised and ready. "He will come here," James said. "When he does, I speak first. Nobody does anything before I do, understood?" "What if he causes trouble?" Cole said. "Then we address it, but we start with words." He looked at each of his sons in turn. "Ella is in this house, and she is staying in this house. That is not a question anyone will be asking, including him. And I want her treated accordingly by everyone in this family and everyone who sets foot on this property. It was then in that moment that it happened. Cole started to say something, and James looked at him with that flat dark gaze, and Cole stopped, and James said in a voice that was low and absolute and left no room for discussion, "She is not a stranger anymore. She is the heart of everything here, so I will thank you to remember that when he comes." The kitchen was very quiet. Danny looked at his father with his wide-open expression, and what was on his face was not surprise exactly, but something closer to recognition, the recognition of something that had been true for a while being said out loud for the first time. Rand nodded once, slowly. Cole looked at the table. Then he looked at his father. Then something shifted in his face too, something giving way that had been held for a long time. He said, "All right, Pa." Ella was not in the kitchen when James said this. She was in her room, but it was a small house and the walls were not thick, and she heard every word. She sat on the edge of her bed with her hands folded in her lap, and her heart doing something that she did not attempt to contain or redirect. She heard his voice saying it as clearly as if she were in the room, the heart of everything here. She pressed her hands together harder and breathed and let it be true. Gerald Morrow came to the rolling cross the following afternoon. He came on a hired horse, which was at least more appropriate to the terrain than the carriage, and he arrived in the mid-afternoon when the light was going golden across the flat land, and the wind had dropped to almost nothing. He was a tall man, well-dressed even in traveling clothes, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that was still handsome in a way that required maintenance, and was beginning to show the cost of that maintenance. He looked like what he was, a wealthy city man who had come a very long way, and was not entirely sure the journey had been worth it, but was too committed to turn back. James was standing on the porch when he arrived. He had been standing there for 20 minutes, because he had been informed by the delivery boy's second note that Morrow had hired a horse and headed south, and James was not the kind of man who let things come to him when he could meet them instead. Cole stood at the corner of the barn. Rand was near the water trough. Danny was inside in the kitchen with Ella, which was where James had asked him to stay. Morrow dismounted and looked at James and said, with the automatic smoothness of a man who had practiced charm until it was reflexive, "Good afternoon. I'm looking for James Atkins." "You found him," James said. Morrow smiled. It was a good smile and it communicated nothing true. "I'm Gerald Morrow from St. Louis. I believe you have a woman in your employ by the name of Ella Collins, a mutual acquaintance. We have Miss Collins here, yes. I've come to bring her home." He said it easily, as if this were an unremarkable errand. "She's been through a difficult time and I'm worried about her well-being, and I think it's best for everyone if she comes back to familiar circumstances." "She is in her home," James said. Morrow's smooth expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. "I beg your pardon. She lives and works here. This is her home. She is not going anywhere with you." "Mr. Atkins, I understand this might seem irregular, but Ella and I have a long relationship, and I assure you she will want to hear what I have to say." "Then you can say it from right where you're standing," James said, "and she can hear you from there." There was a moment of perfect stillness, and then the kitchen door opened and Ella came out onto the porch. She had not planned to come out. She had been listening from inside with Danny beside her, and something in the quality of the exchange had pulled her out, the conviction that this was not something she could allow James to manage entirely on her behalf, that Morrow was her problem and her answer to give. She stepped out onto the porch and stood beside James and looked at Gerald Morrow. He looked at her. His expression shifted into something that she recognized as the look he wore when he was recalculating, when a situation had moved outside the parameters he had planned for. She understood, not fitting the picture he had brought with him. He had come expecting a woman who had been isolated and made anxious by 6 weeks in unfamiliar country, a woman ready to be relieved. She was not that woman. "Ella," he said, and his voice went softer and more private. "I've come all this way. Won't you at least speak with me alone?" "No," she said. Her voice was steady. She had spent 2 years being afraid of this man, and then 4 months of traveling and arriving and building something, and she found that she was not afraid of him here in the afternoon light with the solid presence of James Atkins beside her, and the knowledge that she was standing on ground that was, in the ways that mattered, her own. "There is nothing you can say to me that requires privacy, Mr. Morrow. You can say it here. You're being unreasonable. I am being clear. That is not the same thing." His face changed again. The smooth social surface cracked slightly and something colder showed through. "I have invested a great deal in finding you. I have been patient. I have given you time to come to your senses. I am running out of patience." James moved. He did not lunge or shout. He stepped forward just one step, off the porch and onto the hard-packed ground of the yard, and he stood at full height with his hands loose at his sides and his dark eyes on Morrow with the particular quality of attention that a man gives to something he is prepared to address physically if the situation requires it. "That sounds like a threat," James said, very quietly. Morrow looked at him. He was not a coward exactly, but he was the kind of man who used other people to enforce his will rather than his own body, and he was standing in a yard on a ranch 12 miles from town with 3 men visible, and the distinct impression that there were more he could not see, and whatever calculation he was running did not come out in his favor. "It is not a threat," Morrow said, pulling the smooth surface back into place with visible effort. "It is simply the truth." "The truth," James said, "is that Miss Collins came here of her own free will and is employed here lawfully and is not under any obligation to you or anyone else. The truth is that she's made her wishes clear. And the truth is that you are on private property and you have not been invited to stay." Morrow looked past James at Ella. It was a last attempt, and she saw it for what it was, the look of a man who is hoping that what he thinks he owns will assert itself even now. "Ella," he said, "surely you understand that you need—" "I need nothing from you," she said. "I have not needed anything from you for 2 years, and I will not need anything from you in the future. I am asking you to leave, and I am asking you not to return." A long silence. Then Gerald Morrow turned very deliberately and mounted his hired horse and rode back the way he had come without another word. Cole came from the corner of the barn and stood watching him go. Rand came from the water trough. Danny appeared in the kitchen doorway. James turned and looked at Ella. She was trembling slightly. She had not known she was trembling until it was over and the immediate focus that had carried her through it relaxed. She pressed her hands together and breathed. James was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something unguarded and direct, without the usual compression and control. He looked like a man who had just watched someone be brave and was not sure what to do with the particular feeling that produced. He said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, because she was still trembling and it seemed ridiculous to pretend otherwise, she said, "No, I will be." He took one more step toward her, and his hand came up and touched her face, just his fingers against her cheek for a moment, the kind of touch that has nothing to do with the practical and everything to do with the person. He touched her the way you touch something you are afraid might not be as real as it looks. She did not pull away. She turned her face very slightly into his hand, the smallest movement, and she felt his breath catch from where she was standing. Danny made a sound that was partly a cleared throat and partly a suppressed noise of pure joy. James took his hand away. "Go do something useful," he said to his sons, and they went, Cole shaking his head and Rand smiling quietly and Danny going backward into the kitchen so he could watch for as long as possible. James looked at Ella. "He won't be back," he said. "How do you know?" "Because men like that are brave when they think they have an advantage. He doesn't have one here." He looked at her steadily. "And because I'll speak with Sheriff Holt tomorrow and make sure there is a record of today's visit and what was said." She nodded. She believed him. She had come in 6 weeks to believe him in a way that was bone-deep and settled. She said, "James." She looked at him, this closed, gruff, careful man who had taken her hand in the barn and put salve on her burn and stood on his own porch and told a man with money and connections that she was staying because she was not a stranger here. She was the heart of everything here. "I need to say something," she said. "Go ahead. I came here to be safe. I did not come here expecting anything more than safety. And what has she stopped? Started again. What has happened here, what I have come to feel being here, is not what I planned for. And I understand that it is possibly inconvenient and that you may not. Ella, he said. She stopped. I'm not a man who says things he does not mean, he said. He looked at her with the direct, steady gaze that was the truest expression of who he was. And I don't feel the way I feel about you as a matter of convenience or inconvenience. I feel it because it is there and it has been there for some time, and I am not young enough or foolish enough to pretend it isn't. He paused. I know I am not an easy man. No, she said honestly. A flicker of something crossed his face that might have been humor. I know this is a rough life. I know what a rough life is, she said. I am not afraid of it. No, he said, and he was looking at her now with something warm moving in his expression, something that transformed him the way his rare smiles transformed him. You're afraid of other things, but not that. What am I afraid of? He thought for a moment. Trusting incorrectly, he said. Being made small, someone else deciding what you need. He paused. I don't do those things. I know, she said softly. I know you don't. He reached out and took her hand, the uninjured one, and held it in both of his the way he had held the burned one in the barn, with careful attention and a warmth that was not about the practical at all. Then stay, he said, not as the housekeeper. Stay as whatever this is between us, whatever you are willing for it to be. She looked down at her hand in his and then up at his face. Whatever I'm willing for it to be, she repeated. I won't push you, he said. I am many things, but I don't push. I know that too. She turned her hand so that it held his instead of the other way around, and she felt him go very still in that way he had when something mattered, and he was not going to allow himself to respond to it carelessly. All right, she said. His hand tightened around hers very slightly. That was all, but it was enough. The weeks that followed were the best kind of complicated. James Atkins was, as advertised, not an easy man. He had opinions about how things should be done that were firmly held and not always correct, and he was not naturally inclined toward the softer gestures that made a person feel cherished rather than simply regarded. He expressed care through action. A fire laid before she came downstairs. The good chair moved closer to the window because she liked the light. The fence on the south side of the kitchen garden repaired without being asked because he had noticed her looking at it with the calculating gaze she used when something needed doing. She learned to receive these things as the declarations they were. And she found her own language for it. The cup of coffee that appeared at his elbow in the late morning, the particular way she remembered how he took his food, and how he liked his space arranged, and what silences he needed. They were learning each other with the careful thoroughness of people who had both been burned by loss and were not willing to be careless about what they were building. Cole's shift was gradual and then sudden. He had maintained his watchfulness for 3 weeks after the confrontation with Morrow, assessing and recalculating, and then one evening at supper he said, "Miss Collins, I owe you an apology." The table went quiet. "I made some unfair judgments early on," Cole said, with the particular difficulty of a man who is sincere but does not find sincerity easy. "You were straightforward with me when I pushed. You were straight with my father too, and he stopped. You've been good for this house. That's all I wanted to say." Ella looked at him. "Thank you, Cole," she said simply, without making it bigger than it needed to be, which was exactly the right response, and Cole visibly appreciated it. Danny, who had no apologies to make because he had never had doubts, celebrated this exchange by attempting to bake a celebratory cake using the recipe Ella had taught him. And the result was edible but lopsided. And Ella told him it was excellent and meant it. And Danny beamed with the uncomplicated joy that was his particular gift to the household. January brought a hard frost that killed the last of the kitchen garden, and frosted the windows every morning in patterns that Ella found beautiful in the way that severe things can be beautiful when you are warm inside looking out. She had winterized the house as best she could with what was available, and she had established a routine that the whole ranch now ran on with the easy efficiency of something that fits the shape it was meant for. She was, she understood, no longer performing the role of housekeeper. She was living here. The distinction was not dramatic or announced. It simply was. James proposed on a Saturday evening in February of 1879 in the kitchen, which was not a romantic venue in any conventional sense, but was perhaps the most honest venue available to them. The room where she had laughed for the first time on this property, and where they had spoken the truths that mattered, and where the business of daily life accumulated into the substance of something real. He had been quiet at supper and quieter after, and she had understood from his particular quality of quiet that something was in preparation, and she had given him room to arrive at it. The boys had gone to their beds. The house was still. She was sitting at the table with her journal, writing by lamplight, and he came and sat across from her the way he had sat on the night she told him about Gerald Morrow, in the same chair with his elbows on his knees. She looked up. He said, "I think you know what I want to ask you." "I believe I have a general idea," she said carefully. Something moved across his face that was close to a smile. "I am not good at this," he said. "I was better the first time when I was younger and hadn't yet figured out that there were 1,000 ways it could go wrong." "It went wrong the first time despite your being good at it," she said gently. "I don't think skill has much to do with it." He looked at her. "No," he said, "I don't suppose it does." He was quiet for a moment. "What I want to say is that I would like you to marry me, not because it's the practical thing, though it may be, not because of what it would look like to anyone else. Because you are," he stopped, and she saw him work at it, saw this man who did not waste words searching for the right ones. "You are the best thing that has happened to this house since we built it. You are what this place needed and didn't know it. And I would be a fool not to tell you that clearly and ask you directly." She had closed her journal. She was watching him with her full attention, which she had found in 4 months was the thing he responded to most, being fully seen and not looked past. "James," she said, "I know I am Gruff. I know I am not James." She stood up from her chair and came around the table and sat in the chair beside him, the one that was usually Danny's, and she was close enough that their knees were almost touching. "Ask me." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Will you marry me, Ella Collins?" She said yes. He took her face in his hands then, both of them, and kissed her with the full weight of everything he was, without restraint or uncertainty. A kiss that was a declaration and a promise and a homecoming all at once. And she kissed him back with the same totality. And the lamp burned low, and the frost was on the windows, and the Texas night pressed up against the glass, and neither of them noticed any of it. They were married in March of 1879, in the church without a steeple in Harlan's Creek, with Sheriff Holt as a witness and Patsy Orman from the general store, and all 3 of James's sons in attendance. Danny looking like he might burst from happiness, Rand smiling quietly, and Cole standing straight and serious and present in a way that said everything he would not say with words. Ella wore her best dress, which was not the traveling sage green but a darker blue that Patsy Orman had helped her alter, and she carried wildflowers that Danny had ridden 2 miles to find, which was the kind of gesture that explained everything necessary about who Danny Atkins was. James wore his best coat and his second best hat, because his best hat had been lost in a creek crossing 4 years prior, and he had never found its equal, and he stood at the front of the plain church and watched Ella come down the aisle toward him with an expression on his face that his sons had never seen before, open and unguarded and full, the full version of everything he usually kept compressed. The preacher said the words. They said the words back. James put on her finger a ring that had been his grandmother's, a simple band of gold that fit her hand as if it had been made for it. When the preacher said he could kiss his bride, James cupped her face in his hands and kissed her once, briefly and tenderly, the most public version of the private language they had been building for 4 months, and the people in the small church made the sounds of people witnessing something true. Cole shook his father's hand afterward, which for Cole was as warm as a bare hug from anyone else. Rand embraced her for the first time, which she had not expected, and said quietly into her ear, "I'm glad you answered that advertisement." and she had to compose herself carefully. Danny actually did hug her, with the enthusiasm of a young man who had not yet learned to moderate his physical expressions of feeling, and she hugged him back hard. Patsy Orman cried in the pragmatic, brief way of a woman who is not embarrassed by feelings, but is also not going to let them run on too long. They rode home to the Rolling Cross in the late afternoon, the four of them in the wagon together, James and Ella on the seat with the warmth of his arm against hers, and the wide golden land opening all around, and the sky going pink at the edges in the west. Danny talked without stopping for the first 6 miles, and then fell asleep sitting up in the wagon bed, which caused Rand to rearrange him into a safer position without waking him. And Cole watched the road, and occasionally looked at his father and Ella with an expression that she was learning to read as the Cole equivalent of contentment. Spring came to the Rolling Cross with the urgency that spring always has in flat country, everything happening at once, the grass coming green in a week, the horses restless, the work of the ranch expanding to fill the longer days. Ella took on the kitchen garden again with the kind of focused intent that she brought to anything she decided to reclaim, and by April it was properly fenced and planted and producing. She and James found their shape together the way people do, through the daily accumulation of small decisions about how to occupy the same space. He was still gruff. She was still precise. He sometimes forgot to say things that wanted saying, and she sometimes had to tell him directly what she needed rather than waiting for him to notice it, which she had learned from the early days of her widowhood was not a defeat but a skill. They argued twice in April and once in May, and all 3 times the arguments were about practical matters that had emotional weight, the way arguments always are, and all 3 times they resolved them in the kitchen late at night when the boys were asleep, and they could be direct without an audience. He was a more communicative man in private than in public, which was not a surprise but was a gift, and he continued to surprise her in the ways she had not anticipated. He had kept his late wife Margaret's Bible on the shelf, and one evening he took it down and showed her the inscription inside the front cover, which was in Margaret's handwriting, and he told her about Margaret in the contained way. He told her about things that mattered, enough that she understood the shape of the grief and the depth of the love and the particular loneliness of the years after. She told him about Thomas Collins, her first husband, who had been a kind man and a gentle one who had died of a fever when he was 31 and taken with him the future they had planned. She told James about the grief of that loss and about the way Gerald Morrow had appeared in the aftermath like something that moved into a space emptied by absence, and how long it had taken her to understand what he was because grief had made her slow. James listened to all of it. Then he said, "You are here now," in the way he said things that were meant to be the end of something, not dismissively but with the particular finality of a man who believes in moving forward from where you are. She said, "Yes, I am." He put his arm around her and she settled into his side, and they sat in the kitchen by the fire, and the night was quiet around the house, and it was enough. It was considerably more than enough. Cole met a woman in Harlan's Creek in June, a schoolteacher named Alice Brandt who had come from Arkansas the previous fall and who was, in Cole's precise and considered assessment, exceptional. He did not talk about her for 2 weeks after he met her, processing the information privately in his characteristic way, and then he mentioned her once at supper with a studied casualness that fooled no one except possibly himself. Ella said nothing about it directly, but the next time Cole came in from town she had baked his preferred pie, which was apple with a thick crust, and she set it on the table when he sat down, and he looked at it and then at her, and she looked back with perfectly neutral eyes, and he said, "She's going to come for Sunday supper," in a tone that suggested this was a fact he had decided rather than a question, which was very much how Cole operated. Alice came for Sunday supper and was measured and intelligent and completely unintimidated by James, which James appeared to find genuinely interesting. Danny fell a little in love with her in the harmless, brotherly way he did with most interesting women. Rand assessed her and concluded, in his long-paused, thoughtful way, that she was probably the right kind of person for Cole. Ella simply watched Cole watch Alice and recognized the expression. By August, Cole and Alice were courting in the formal way of a couple who are serious about it. Cole was 26 years old and Alice was 24, and they were serious about it. It was August, too, that Ella realized she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told James, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted to be certain herself first, to hold it quietly and let it be real before it became the property of the household. She told him on a Thursday evening, in the kitchen, in the chair where she had said yes, and she watched his face go through something she had not seen it do before, a cascade of expressions, surprise and then wonder, and then something that was almost fear but was actually just the intensity of feeling that big things produce in people who care about things deeply. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his and held them with a firmness that communicated everything his voice was apparently not ready to manage. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "Good." He cleared his throat. "Good." She was smiling at him with the fullness of it because the look on his face was not something she had seen before, and it was, in its way, the most beautiful thing she had seen since arriving in Texas. "James," she said, "you can say something." He looked at her, and then he said, with a directness that was entirely characteristic, "I did not think I would get to have this again." His voice was rough at the edges in the way it got when he was managing something that wanted to overflow. He stopped. "There is not a word big enough." "I know," she said. He lifted her hands and pressed them against his chest, over his heart, and she felt it beating under her palms. "Thank you," he said. She had received a great many things from James Atkins in the months since she had come to the Rolling Cross. But that was the one she kept closest, in the deep private part of herself, where the things that mattered most were stored. She told the boys at supper that evening. Danny made a noise that was somewhere between a whoop and a shout, and was immediately told by Cole to compose himself, though Cole's own expression was doing something genuinely warm. Rand smiled the broad, rare smile that appeared only when something was genuinely wonderful, and said, "That's good news," with the understated sincerity that was the most Rand thing possible. The pregnancy went well. She was healthy and the country was agreeing with her. She had said this to James on several occasions, that the open air and the physical work and the particular quality of the Rolling Cross life suited her in ways she had not anticipated. She continued to work through the fall, adjusting as necessary, with the practical approach she took to bodily matters. James was attentive in the way that was consistent with who he was, present and careful and occasionally excessive in a way that required gentle correction, as when he suggested she not carry the water bucket in October, and she told him firmly that she was expecting a child, not made of glass, and he accepted this correction with the good grace of a man who knows when he has overstepped. Their son was born in April of 1880, on a Tuesday afternoon when the spring was fully underway, and the land outside was green and gold. The doctor came from Harlan's Creek, and it was James who held her hand through the labor with the focused, unflinching presence he brought to everything difficult. And it was James who was given the baby first, the doctor placing the swaddled infant into his arms while Ella was being tended to. And the look on James Atkins's face in that moment was something that Danny, who had been permitted to stand in the doorway, described to Cole afterward as the most astonishing thing he had ever witnessed. They named him Thomas, for Ella's first husband who had been kind and gentle and deserved to be remembered, and James who had liked the man without meeting him, because Ella had described him carefully. Thomas James Atkins, called Tom by everyone within the first week. Tom had his father's dark eyes and his mother's auburn hair, and the particular quality of presence that seemed to run in the Atkins line, an occupancy of whatever space he was in that was assertive without being demanding. He was a healthy, strong baby who slept well and ate well, and regarded the world with the interested, assessing gaze of a child who is paying close attention. James was, with Tom, different than Ella had expected and more than she had hoped. He was patient in a way that was not always visible in other areas of his life, and he handled the baby with the same careful precision he brought to anything delicate. And he talked to Tom in a low, private voice when he thought no one was listening, the kind of talking that was not meant to be heard, but that said everything about the interior of the man. She heard it once, coming through the half-open door of their bedroom early in the morning. James was sitting with Tom in the chair by the window, the baby awake and looking at him, and James was saying quietly, "This is what it looks like when something works out. You are going to grow up on good land with people who love you, and that is not nothing. That is everything." She stood in the hallway with her hand on the doorframe and her eyes doing something that required a moment to address before she went in. The Rolling Cross in the summer of 1880 was a different place than the one Ella Collins had arrived at 2 years before on an October Tuesday with a carpet bag and a determination to outrun the shape her life had made. It was larger, in a sense that had nothing to do with acreage. The house had been extended in the winter, a room added to the south side for Tom's nursery, and eventually, Ella and James both understood without discussing it directly, for whatever came after Tom, because they were both people who had learned that life expanded when you gave it room to. Cole and Alice had married in October of 1879 in the same church where James and Ella had married, and Alice had joined the household in the practical way that the West required, bringing her intelligence and her directness and her particular brand of warm pragmatism into a house that was already quite full of personality, and finding her place in it with the confidence of a woman who was not easily dislocated. She and Ella had found each other's measure in the first 2 weeks and established a friendship that was honest and useful, the kind that comes from two capable women who respect what they each bring. Cole was, with Alice, a different version of himself than the one who had stood in the kitchen doorway and asked Ella pointed questions in October of 1878. He was still serious. He was still the eldest. But there was something unlocked in him that had not been there before, a warmth that he had been keeping behind his watchfulness, and it was good for him and visible to everyone. Rand was, by the summer of 1880, quietly involved with the daughter of a rancher 3 miles east, a young woman named June, whose family ran cattle on the other side of the creek. He had not announced anything, and they did not push him, because Rand would arrive at his own conclusions in his own time, and pressuring him produced only longer pauses. But he came home from the Langford ranch with a particular quality of distracted contentment that was new, and James watched this with the satisfaction of a man who has outlasted his own grief long enough to see his children find what he had found. Danny was 22 in the summer of 1880, and not yet finding anyone, which did not concern him in the least because Danny was constitutionally incapable of being concerned about anything for more than an afternoon. He had become a genuinely good cook, which he attributed entirely to Ella's teaching, and which Ella attributed equally to his own enthusiasm and natural aptitude. He had also, somewhat to everyone's surprise, developed a talent for gentling difficult horses, which the Rolling Cross had occasion to need regularly, and this had given him a purpose that suited his temperament perfectly. Ella was expecting their second child by the fall of 1880. She told James in September, sitting on the porch in the evening with Tom asleep inside, and the stars coming out over the flat country in the particular way they came out in this part of Texas, all at once and in overwhelming numbers, as if the sky could not be bothered with subtlety. James looked at her for a moment and then put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat in the dark with the stars and the wide land and the sounds of the ranch settling into the night. "Are you happy?" he said. He did not ask this often. He was a man who believed in observation over inquiry, who read the evidence of things rather than requesting testimony. But he asked sometimes, quietly and directly, in the way he asked things that mattered. She thought about it. She believed in honesty too much to answer quickly. She thought about St. Louis and the years of making herself smaller and the years of loneliness after Thomas died and the particular kind of fear that had carried her onto the stage in San Antonio and all the way to this porch, this man, this life. Yes, she said. And because she was Ella Collins and she did not do things by half, she turned her face up to his in the dark and said, extraordinarily, unexpectedly, completely, yes. He pressed his lips to her forehead, and then to the side of her face and pulled her closer, and they sat together under the Texas stars until the night grew late and the air went cool, and Tom made a sound inside that said he was waking up, and they went in together to tend to him. And the door of the rolling cross closed behind them, and the lights were warm in the windows, and the night lay quiet over all the surrounding land. The second baby, a girl this time, was born in the spring of 1881 and named Margaret Ella, called Maggie, with James's late wife's name first because James had asked, and Ella had agreed without hesitation, because she was not a woman who needed to diminish the love that had come before in order to believe in the love that was present. Margaret Ella came into the world with considerable energy and immediately established herself as a person with opinions, which made James laugh in his rare complete way and made Danny inform everyone that he had predicted exactly this. Tom was 13 months old when Maggie arrived, and he accepted her with the equanimity of a child who had been raised in a house full of confident people and had absorbed some portion of that confidence by proximity. He was walking by then, with the determined, slightly top-heavy gait of a toddler who has recently discovered the usefulness of vertical mobility, and he followed James around the yard with the focused single-mindedness of someone who has decided which person they are modeling themselves on. James took this seriously. He crouched to Tom's level regularly and explained things in the low, patient voice he used with the child, and Tom listened with the intent dark eyes that were so precisely his father's that it caused Ella to stop sometimes and simply look at the two of them together, with a fullness in her chest that she had no adequate words for. Rand married June Langford in the fall of 1881, in a ceremony that was larger than Cole and Alice's had been because the Langfords had 4 siblings and all of them attended. June was steady and warm and immediately adored by Danny, and respectfully approved by Cole and deeply welcomed by Ella, who saw in June a straightforward goodness that was exactly what Rand needed and what the rolling cross had room for. The ranch expanded its cattle operation that same year, with Cole taking on more of the management as James trusted him with more. It was a natural transition, the passing of weight from one generation to the next done gradually enough that it did not feel like loss but like growth. James did not retire from the work. He was constitutionally incapable of it, but he was 53 years old and had earned the right to choose where he put his energy, and he put it increasingly in the places that mattered most. He put it in the evenings on the porch with Ella, in the early mornings with his coffee and the light coming up over the flat land, in the particular conversations he had with his sons that were different now than they had been before Ella, more direct, less compressed, as if her presence had given him permission to let some of what he felt take up more space. He put it in Tom's first word, which was hat, spoken with great intention, and pointed at James's hat on the peg by the door, which became a household story immediately. And in Maggie's first year, which was a year of strong-willed personhood expressed through extremely clear preferences about everything from food to who she would permit to hold her. She was, everyone agreed, her father in miniature in all the ways that counted and her mother in all the ways that explained it. It was in December of 1882, 4 years after Ella had stepped off the stage in Harlan's Creek with a carpet bag and a determination, that she sat down at the table in the kitchen with her journal, which she had been writing in since she was 15 years old, and she looked at the page and then at the window, and at the winter light coming through the glass. She began to write. She wrote about St. Louis, and about Gerald Morrow, and about the advertisement in the Dispatch, and about the 11 days of travel and the stagecoach, and the moment she stepped out into the dust of Harlan's Creek and looked at the sky. She wrote about a man nearly colliding with her outside a closed livery, and the 12-mile drive in silence, and Danny running out of the barn, and the first time she laughed at the rolling cross. She wrote about burned hands and salve, and a letter from a man who had made her life small, and the specific quality of safety that came from standing beside someone who could not be moved. She wrote about a kitchen table and a question, and the word yes, and what it opened. She wrote about 2 children with dark eyes, and a house full of people who had become the shape of her life, who had become so thoroughly the context of her existence that the idea of any other context was something she could barely reconstruct. She wrote at the end of the entry, in the precise handwriting she had had since the nuns at her school in Missouri taught her, "I did not know what I was coming to. I knew only that I had to go somewhere, but it turns out that I was coming here, specifically. To this house and this land and these people. There is something that feels like design in it, though I am careful with that word. What I will say is that I am grateful. And that gratitude and love, when they are this complete, feel like the same thing." She closed the journal. Outside, the winter light lay flat and gold across the land, and the creek was bright where it caught the sun. Inside, Tom was making the noises that indicated he was awake from his nap, and communicating this to anyone in range. Maggie was with Danny in the barn, allegedly helping him with a recalcitrant mare, and actually mostly watching and commenting on the proceedings with the confidence of a 1-year-old, who considers herself an authority on most things. Ella heard James's boots on the porch, the particular weight and rhythm of them that she had known for 4 years and could distinguish from any other sound. He came in and took his hat off and put it on the peg, the same peg Tom had pointed at and said, "Hat," and he looked at her at the table and said, "Writing." "Finished," she said. He came and stood beside her, and she tipped her face up, and he looked down at her in the warm, particular way he had learned to look at her, without the old compression, with the fullness that the years had made available to both of them. "Tom's awake," she said. "I hear him. He'll want you. He always wants me." He said this with the rare, complete satisfaction of a man who cannot believe his own luck and is grateful for it every day. "I'll get him." He went down the hall, and she heard him say the boy's name and heard Tom's immediate response of pure delight, and she sat at the kitchen table in the December light, and the sounds of her life surrounded her, and she was, in exactly the words she had written in the journal, extraordinary and unexpected and complete. The Rolling Cross Ranch grew and changed in the years that followed. Cole and Alice had 2 children by 1884, a son and then a daughter. Rand and June had a boy who arrived in 1883 and filled the house with additional noise and happiness. Danny fell in love at 25 with a woman who came to Harlan's Creek to teach alongside Alice, a lively and curious young woman from San Antonio named Clara, and he pursued her with the wholehearted Danny-specific enthusiasm that had always characterized his approach to things he cared about. And Clara, who had not been prepared for someone quite so openly devoted, was won over by the end of that first school year. The ranch became, as ranches do when they work, a kind of institution of its own. The Rolling Cross cattle were known in the region as good stock. James's reputation as a rancher who dealt fairly and expected fair dealing in return gave the property a standing that was useful in the practical ways, and more than that in the ways that were not practical but mattered more. Ella Collins Atkins became, in Harlan's Creek and the surrounding country, the person people came to when they needed something organized, or when they needed someone who would listen without judging and think without assuming. Patsy Orman at the general store referred to her with the particular admiration of a woman who recognizes competence and values it, and the 2 of them had a friendship that had grown from that first note, and the delivery boy, and the shared understanding of what it meant to be a woman who handled what was in front of her. Sheriff Holt retired in 1884, and the record of Gerald Morrow's visit sat in the files of the Harlan's Creek Sheriff's Office and was never needed again. Morrow had gone back to St. Louis and found other interests, which was, Ella reflected, the likely truth of what he had always been, a man who wanted things primarily because they were unavailable, and who moved on when they proved too difficult to acquire. She did not think about him often. There was too much in the present to think about. There was Tom, who was 4 years old by 1884 and deeply interested in horses, and in everything his father could teach him about them, with the concentrated attention of a child who has identified their purpose and is already working toward it. There was Maggie, who was 3 and already negotiating with everyone in the household, with a diplomatic skill that made Ella suspect she was going to grow up to run something. And there was the third child, whose presence Ella had suspected by Christmas of 1883 and confirmed by January of 1884, a fact that she told James sitting on the porch in a January that was cold but clear, with the stars out in their overwhelming Texas numbers. He had not said anything for a long moment. Then he had pulled her against him with both arms and held her in the way he held things he was certain about, completely and without reservation, and she had leaned into the warmth and the solidity of him and felt the heartbeat of the ranch around them, the horses in the barn and the boys in the house and the land going out in all directions under the cold stars. "James," she said. "Thank you," she said, for the same thing he had thanked her for 4 years before, for exactly the same thing. He pressed his lips to her hair and held her closer and said, "Thank you," back, and they sat in the January night, and the rolling cross breathed around them like something living, which of course it was, which of course they all were together. The third child, another boy, was born in August of 1884 and named James Daniel, called Jamie by everyone except his father, who called him by his full name in the particular way that fathers call children by their full names when they want them to understand something important. Jamie arrived in the world with the auburn hair and the Atkins eyes, and the combination of his parents' natures in him that was, somehow, something new, a person who was entirely his own even while carrying all of them in him. James Atkins held his third child and his fifth in this life, and looked at Ella across the room with an expression that she had come to know as the full and uncontained version of him, the one he showed her and their children and no one else, and she held it in her chest the way she held all the most important things, carefully, and with the understanding that it was irreplaceable. The rolling cross sat on the flat Texas land under the enormous sky, and the years turned, and the children grew and the work continued, and the love accumulated, not the dramatic, overwhelming kind that burned bright and quick, but the better kind, the deep-rooted kind, the kind that is built from thousands of ordinary mornings and the particular way someone hands you a coffee cup and the feel of a hand held in the dark and a voice saying things that are quiet and true. It was this love that Ella Collins had not come looking for and had found anyway, on a Tuesday in October of 1878, stepping off a stage into the dust of a small Texas town with a carpet bag and 3 books and a journal, and the specific courage of a woman who has decided that safety is worth whatever it costs to find it. What she had found instead was more than safety. It was the full version of a life, rooted and growing and warm, on land that was hers not by deed, but by the deeper claim of having given it her love and her labor and her years, the heart of everything. That is what James had said she was, standing in the kitchen in December of 1878 with his sons watching him and the fire at his back, the heart of everything here. He had been right in the way that direct men are right when they say things they mean, and she had been right to believe it. And the rolling cross went on under the wide Texas sky, all the people in it, and all the love between them and all the years stretching out ahead. And every morning the light came up over the eastern horizon and lay gold across the flat land, and touched the windows of the house, where James Atkins drank his first coffee of the day in the kitchen that smelled of last night's supper and this morning's beginnings, and where Ella Atkins, née Collins, stood at the window with her cup in her hands and watched the light come, and felt the weight and warmth of everything she had, and everything she was, and everything this place had become. And she was, as she had written in her journal, grateful and gratitude and love when they were this complete, were exactly the same thing.